I promised we would revisit those cows on their beautiful pasture. I took this picture a few years ago in the Alps, in a place not too far from one of the case studies in Elinor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons. So what's the story here? The term, the tragedy of the commons, was coined by ecologist Garrett Hardin in a science paper that you find in your recommended readings. He wrote a gloomy and, in its policy recommendations, very extreme and unpalatable paper relating to the fear of overpopulation. So what does he mean with the tragedy of the commons? Well, he's talking about the English common, common land, accessible for everyone in the village, a pasture with no limit to access, so what we know as a common pool resource from the beginning of the lecture, no excludability, but rivalry in consumption. As individual herdsmen add just one more cow and another cow and another cow, they individually reap the benefits. They can sell the cows or their meat and make profit. But the more cows we add to the resource, to the common pasture, we ultimately destroy the resource altogether. So we add more cows and more cows to the pasture, and ultimately, through overgrazing, we end up with an apocalyptic wasteland. And this logic is not completely made up. If you think about global fish stocks or climate change, we might well believe that we find ourselves in tragedy of the commons type situations every once in a while. To Garrett Hardin, the bleak outcome is really inevitable, hence the word tragedy. And the only solution to this tragedy of the commons is either privatization or nationalization, so the national government taking action. But a few years later, political scientist Lynn Ostrom said, no, you got it all wrong. Self-regulation is possible. There's a third option. And Garrett Hardin's prime example of the English commons is empirically wrong. It is theoretically appealing to think of these herdsmen as sort of individual profit maximizers. But if you look around the UK, you will find that the commons are not the apocalyptic wastelands that Garrett Hardin expects. It's the opposite. They are beautiful meadows used sustainably. And that is what Lynn Ostrom and her workshoppers at Indiana University found around the world when they did this sort of hard empirical work of collecting case studies from everywhere. They looked at irrigation systems in Spain and meadows in Switzerland and fisheries and communities all over the planet. And they found that there are common pool resources everywhere, and they do create problems. But people have been able to find solutions to these problems everywhere. How? They create institutions. They create rules. Ad hoc rules, different rules in many cases, specific to the resource in question, but essentially governance structures and institutions that help them solve the problems that the common pool resources throw up. And what Lynn Ostrom and her workshoppers found was that basically these successful examples of common pool resource management share what she calls design principles. And those are things like clearly defined boundaries, a match between the local conditions and the sort of ad hoc rules and regulations that people have set up for themselves. They usually involve collective choice arrangements. So making sure that everyone who's involved in resource use is actually involved in the rulemaking as well. So political participation, if you want a big word. Monitoring, yeah. So being able to see whether people break the rules. Graduated sanctions, so the ability to punish those who violate the rules the community has set up. And importantly, easily accessible conflict resolution mechanisms, because the common pool resources, of course, create the dynamics that Hardin described, create the problems. But if people are able to come together and adhere to a set of rules and identify when those rules are broken, they are able to solve the problem of the tragedy of the commons. So as communities, we are much better than what Garrett Hardin made of us. And for her work on the commons, Lynn Ostrom was the first woman and also the first political scientist to win the Nobel Prize in Economics. And if you want to hear a little more about her work and about the contrast between her life and Garrett Hardin's life, you should listen to the podcast at the bottom of the slide. And if you listen very, very carefully, you can hear me laugh in the audience. And perhaps that is the core lesson of today's lecture. That cooperation, the provision of public goods, and the sustainable use of common pool resources through self-regulation are possible. And that people and communities all over the world have created institutions and thus found solutions to the problems and dilemmas they find themselves in.